Edward Glaeser is the 11th Eero Saarinen Lecturer. The Saarinen Lecture Series brings speakers to the school who have an important impact on architecture, but who are not necessarily themselves architects. Of course, I just learned that Mr. Glaeser is the son of an architect. I don't know where that puts him in the category of Saarinen lecturers. I did actually know his father quite a bit. The first Saarinen lecturer was Anthony A. Williams, the mayor of Washington, D.C., then the mayor of Washington, D.C. Another Saarinen lecturer was Thomas Krenz, then the director of the Guggenheim Museum. And the 10th Saarinen lecturer was the journalist and author Tom Vanderbilt. There are just wonderful seats down here. Just come on down. I think I'm going to rope off the back seats. Edward Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he's taught since 1992. A graduate of Princeton and the University of Chicago, from which he received his PhD in economics. Professor Glaeser has been widely published in a number of academic and research journals, such as the Journal of Urban Economics, Daedalus, and the American Economic Review. He is a contributor to Bloomberg News, and his writings appeared regularly in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, exploring topics such as housing markets, crime, segregation, transportation networks, and public spending. Professor Glaeser is author of several books, including Agglomeration Economics, published by the University of Chicago in 2010, Exploring and General Equilibrium at MIT in the same year, and recently he published Triumph of the City, How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier, and published by Penguin Press, and the cover is on the screen. It is in Triumph of the City that Dr. Glaeser presents not only an enthusiastic argument for the innovation and opportunities for economic and cultural aggregation that come out of cities, can be born in cities, but also takes critical aim at public policies designed to reinforce and foster suburbanization. Please join me in welcoming Edward Glaeser to our school's podium as he delivers this term's Eero Saarinen lecture, Building a City of Choices.
I'm really terribly honored to be here. As was just said, my father was an architectural historian, and I think if it were just based on preferences and reverence for architecture, I would certainly rather be among you than to be an economist. Unfortunately, I was born, as you will soon observe, with an utter lack of any aesthetic discernment whatsoever. So your path is barred to me, and I had to make do with economics. I want to start illustrating my lack of aesthetic sense with a picture. Only an economist would call this a picture of the United States. And what I've done in this picture is to split America's counties into tenths. Each of those dots is about 300 counties. And I've arranged them by the density levels, by how many people per square mile there are in each one of these counties, from the least dense counties to the most dense counties. The bottom line shows the relationship between per capita income and density across America's counties. And as you can see, it's a strictly increasing line. The densest tenth of America's counties have income levels that are on average more than 50% higher. No, it didn't work.
I was going to tell you that.
Oh, thank you.
That's the best way to work.
Well, let's see if we can get the technology.
You need a pointer?
No, I've got a pointer. I need a clicker. All right. But then I can't walk around. It's my whole shtick is off. The most dense tenth of America's counties are on average 50%. Oh, no, I know how to fix this. It's this thing came out. I think that should do it. Yes, wonderful. Okay, got it. All right, the most dense tenth of America's counties are on average earn 50% more per capita than the least dense fifth of America's counties. This is a general phenomenon that's been documented in almost every society known to us, that as people agglomerate together, come together in cities. And cities are at their heart the absence of physical space between people. They are density, they are proximity, they are closeness. And as density increases, productivity, innovation, earnings increase as well. The three largest metropolitan areas in the United States produce 18% of America's gross domestic product, while including only 13% of America's population. And if the rest of America saw its per capita output rise to the level seen in the New York metropolitan area, our national incomes would go up by over 40%. The top line is perhaps a somewhat more curious fact. That shows the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 at initial density levels. And what you can see is that as density increases, population growth does as well, at least until you get to the densest tenth of counties. Whereas in the start of the 19th century, we left our dense enclaves on the Atlantic Ocean to populate the great open spaces of the American hinterland. As we face the 21st century, we're increasingly moving back, moving towards the old cities, moving towards new cities that are being formed, moving towards density, moving towards agglomeration. This connection shouldn't surprise us. What you're looking at here is the relationship between initial income and growth over the past 10 years. I've split the counties in this case into fifths, and as you can see, the wealthiest fifth of counties as of the year 2000 experienced average growth rates of about 15%, whereas the least wealthy fifth of America's counties lost population. There was a strong tendency of people to follow the money, which perhaps isn't particularly surprising. But this tendency of people to follow the money explains this somewhat odd fact. And here I've split counties by proximity to a major port. And what you can see here is that the places that are closest to ports grew much more quickly than the places that are farther away from ports. This, of course, doesn't mean that we're all becoming stevedores, for goodness sakes. It's not as if containerization ruled backwards and the wharves of New Haven have come alive again as everyone's working on it. But it's that those ports are the nuclei of the great metropolitan areas that are the real economic heartland of the United States. Now, the success of America's cities, which is seen in their safety, in their social innovation, in their economic productivity, in their high housing prices, in their high levels of income, is dwarfed by the urban transformation that is going on through the world as a whole. Right? We've just, about 5 years ago, crossed that somewhat remarkable halfway point where more than 50% of humanity now lives in cities. And it's hard not to see that fundamentally as a hopeful sign. Because if you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are on average 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third of those countries that are less than 50% urbanized. It's not that we necessarily should ever try and force people off of rural areas into cities. And indeed, I think, in fact, having a plethora of choices, both within and across cities, is a wonderful thing. This is very much the economist's perspective on this. But it's hard not to see, given how incredibly tight the link has been between urbanization and prosperity, that cities are part of a process where humankind moves out of a world that was, dreadful, to a world where there is more promise. And lest you get too misty-eyed about, the rural past was poor, but boy, it was happy, right? Everyone was living on these farms and having a great time of it. Well, clearly, if you think that, you haven't been to rural India lately. Or many of the rural areas of the poorer countries in the world. This is the relationship between self-reported happiness and the share of the population that's urban across countries. And what you can see is that people tend to say that they're happier when they're living in more urbanized countries. It is not true, of course, that within the United States, that people who live in urban areas typically say that they're happier than people who live in non-urban areas. What self-respecting New Yorker is going to admit that they're happy anyway? But it is true, in fact, when you compare urban and rural areas in the developing world, there's a huge self-reported happiness gap where people who live in cities typically say that their well-being is higher. Now, this fact runs against a long-standing hostility to cities, both in this country and elsewhere. Think about the Jeffersonian tradition, one that has, I think, very unfortunate consequences for our modern policy environment, where we often act as if living behind a white picket fence in the suburb is the only way to be a real American. And the same thing is true in the developing world, where there exists a tremendous tendency to idealize the rural past. Gandhi famously said the growth of the nation depends not on cities, but on its villages, right? He had an image of a world in which everyone would spin their own cloth. And yet, with all due respect to the great man, he was wrong. right? The growth of India does not depend on its agriculture. The growth of Africa certainly does not depend on soil, which is very far from being the world's leader in terms of providing agricultural products. It depends upon cities providing a transformation. Cities as the gateways across cultures and civilizations that enable places like Bangalore to be ways in which India, to be transformational areas that can enable India to move into the 21st century. This is an image of the Mindtree campus in Bangalore. And I have absolutely no opinion on its architectural merits whatsoever, so I'm not trying to put it up for that. But it's an amazing place because within this building, within this box here, is just a hive of connected humanity. The software engineers get together every day and they eat lunch on the roof. And the place is just crowded and jamming with people exchanging ideas. And of course, it's not just Indian software engineers exchanging ideas with other Indian software engineers. It's a place in which people from throughout the world, be it other software people from Silicon Valley, or be it investors from Singapore, or be it even the occasional socially awkward Harvard professor, comes by and tries to connect with this Mindtree software consulting thing and to try and be part of that. Now, the other image is the street life in Bangalore outside of Mindtree. And it's a messy street life. It's a street life that actually, I find deeply exciting, but it also reminds us of how challenging urban areas are. And I will come back to this over and over again, but it's important that as I'm giving a very pro-urban talk, to remember that there are downsides of density and that cities require management. And that while the cities of India offer tremendous promise, they also often tremendous challenges. One way to think about this is an abundance of land hides many sins on the part of government. Right? You actually don't need to be extremely competent to get rural Montana to be basically functional. But once you cram people together, it requires a huge amount of government investment. Right? The cities and towns of America were spending as much on water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. There's a reason why people in New York City like government more than people in Montana do. They need it more. Right? And India, in fact, needs to make investments that will make their cities livable and in order to have them play out the promise that they offer. Now, Bangalore and the general trend towards urbanization leads to a thing which I think is the central paradox of my talk, and indeed I think it's a central paradox of our age, which is that we live in an age in which it is effortless to telecommute across the planet, in which we can all occupy whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia and just dial it in, right? Just connect electronically from our own little, electronic cottage, I think it was the phrase that one of the cyberseers once used, and just connect without ever having to be next to each other. Now, this was a view that was espoused 30 years ago with complete confidence that cities were going to be killed by new communications technologies, and yet that really does not seem to be what happened at all. That in so many ways, whether it's in Bangalore, or in Boston, or in London, or in Beijing, right, the cities of the world are thriving and are growing at breakneck pace in the developing world and are resurgent in the developed world. And that's really a puzzle. Why didn't electronic communications kill cities? And it's an important thing for us to understand this because it tells us whether or not we're just in a temporary world in which cities have come back briefly, or whether or not we think actually the long-run trends, far from dispersing humanity, will actually continue to bring us together. Now, this relatively rosy view of cities is so different than the New York City of my youth, right? These are two iconic images from the 1970s in New York, when the city really did seem to lose its way. It was a city that was marked by fiscal distress, it was marked by enormous crime problems, and it was marked above all by incredible industrial decline. The largest economic cluster in the United States, the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, was not automobile production in Detroit, right? It was garment production in New York City. And the garment industry was hammered far more than automobiles were by the first wave of globalization in the 1960s and 1970s. New York was shedding hundreds of thousands of jobs. That economic decline is the backdrop for the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. Of course, a little bit of government mismanagement didn't hurt for creating that crisis. But it left New York in a position where it was desperately begging the federal government to bail it out. And Ford didn't literally tell the city to drop dead, but most people think he actually did mean it. And indeed, it looked like not just President Ford, but history itself was telling New York City and Boston and Buffalo and San Francisco to drop dead in the 1970s. It really looked as if their whole reason for being had evaporated during this time period and that they were dinosaurs headed for the trash heap of history. Indeed, this image of President Carter wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become offered one quite plausible vision of what was going to happen to cities. They were going to hollow out and become this sort of quasi-agricultural wasteland. Because, in fact, the whole economic rationale of cities had vanished. I mean, it wasn't just an issue of the city seeming unmanageable. It was a question of seeing why in the world were we locating in these very expensive old things. Now, to understand why things look so bleak then and why they don't look bleak now, I think it's important to go even further back to understand why America's cities came about to begin with. On some very basic mechanistic level, America's cities, the older cities, grew up to solve a transportation problem. Here we were at the start of the 19th century on the edge of a vast, enormously wealthy nation, right, filled with rich soil and mineral wealth, and yet it was virtually inaccessible. It cost as much in 1816 to move goods 30 miles over land as it did to ship them across the Atlantic Ocean, right? Enormously expensive to get anywhere away from the Atlantic seaboard, and so we perched on that seaboard, clinging to our oceanic lifeline. Cities were, there, and they were typically on the place where the river meets the sea. But only gradually over the 19th century, as we built this network, first the great canals, Erie, Illinois and Michigan, and then the railroads that supplemented the canals, that enabled the wealth of the hinterland to make its way to the markets of the East and Europe. And cities grew up on pinch points, on crucial nodes of that transportation network, like Buffalo, of course, the western terminus of the Erie Canal, where Joseph Dart's elevators, a great 19th century innovation, lifted the grain coming off the boats on the Great Lakes ultimately onto the canal boats. On Chicago, of course, the linchpin of a great watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans. And these places grew up as part of a way of handling this transportation problem. Of course, industries then followed the ports, right? Industries then grew up around these natural places that had a transportation cost advantage. The three dominant industries in New York in the 19th century were sugar refining, printing and publishing, and the garment trade. All three of these industries were children of the port, as indeed New York's dominant industry today, finance was as well. Right? Sugar refining was natural there because New York did so much trade with the Caribbean. And of course, you couldn't refine sugar in the Caribbean during the early 19th century and ship it north because refined sugar crystals would coalesce during a long, hot sea voyage north. You needed to refine them close to the point of production, but hopefully in a central location where you could take advantage of scale economies, because sugar refineries were expensive products. And indeed, great family fortunes like that eventually put Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the White House were formed off sugar refining in New York by people like Isaac Roosevelt, right, who was not, contrary to what Mad Men may tell you. And indeed, Mad Men does mention Isaac Roosevelt and describes him farming. I did not know that Isaac Roosevelt did any farming, but I sure do know he did a lot of sugar refining, which is a perfectly good urban occupation. And in fact, his involvement with politics, that is Isaac Roosevelt's, not Franklin, specifically reflected his unhappiness with British mercantilist policies during the mid and late 18th century. Of course, the garment trade as well, huge amounts of fabric coming in and out of New York because of the trade both with England and with the Caribbean. Right? The first regularly scheduled packet service to New York was put together by Jeremiah Thompson, right, whose role in shipping vast amounts of fabric was because he came out of an English wool-making family. And of course, my favorite story of this is why printing and publishing became so dominant in New York City. The big money in 19th century printing and publishing was, of course, in pirated English novels, right? No, Asian property rights thief had anything on our boys in the 1820s. And indeed, the thing is, with a pirated novel, right, you've really got to publish first. You're not going to make any money off the 8th pirated edition of Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, right? You really have to have the first one to hit the market. And if you've got to have the first one hit the market, then it's really crucial to be in the central port. Because, in fact, the Harper brothers could get Peveril of the Peak, could get this latest Sir Walter Scott novel, before, days before it even showed up in the hands of their Philadelphia competitors, Carey and Lee, and could flood the market with this thing before Carey and Lee could bring it out. Right? And this played a crucial role in giving the Harper brothers their dominance in American publishing during the early 19th century. Of course, Chicago's great industry, by value added, although not by employment. The garment trade was dominant in Chicago by employment as well. But the great industry by value added was the stockyards, right? An industry that very much grew up around the transportation system. The stockyards were basically part of an age-old problem in America, which is how the heck do you get corn to market? So America has this great soil for growing corn. We still do, although we do it with more magical hybrid forms than we ever did in the past. But we still have incredibly rich corn yields. And we did then as well, particularly in the soil near Chicago, which then replaced the older corn hub, Cincinnati, which had taken advantage of the rich soil of the Ohio River Valley. Originally, of course, we shipped corn in whiskey form. Right, whiskey being a portable and often quite tasty means of transporting corn products. And then, of course, we moved to salted pork. And indeed, Cincinnati was America's porkopolis, right, because, in fact, salting the pork was a way to make it durable. Chicago grew first in terms of shipping pork, and then when this clever guy Armour figured out that you could have these refrigerated rail cars by putting the ice on top of the beef instead of below it, so it would drip down. That was apparently the great innovation. They managed to put the stockyards there as well, right? A great industry, very naturally in Chicago, a central location where you could transform the live cattle into dressed beef and move it on the rails east. Now, even when cities form for utterly prosaic reasons, miracles happen when smart people connect with each other. And so it was in Chicago in the 1880s. And this is, of course, for me, by far the most perilous slide for me to get through because it's the only one that really has anything to do with architecture. And as such, it's the area in which I'm far more likely to make a major error. But this, of course, is Jenny's home insurance building, called by some, although, of course, not by all, the first skyscraper. Now, Jenny's building, and of course this is actually the 1890s version, which has the extra, I think, 4 extra stories. But there's, of course, a lively architectural history debate about whether or not this narrative of Jenny as the inventor of the skyscraper is actually accurate, meaning, of course, the skyscraper having some form of steel or cast iron skeleton and being a relatively tall building. There, of course, this debate has been going on since the 1880s when Buffington had his patent that he fought for so assiduously. I think the main hub of the debate right now, of course, is that only the 2 front walls of this building, at least in the articles that I've read, someone may know better, only the 2 front walls here have a steel skeleton, right? The back 2 party walls have a traditional masonry structure. And indeed, there appears to be a lively architectural history debate about whether or not Jenny deserves this title, or whether or not it should go to Hollibard and Roche, or whether or not it should go to Sullivan, or whether or not it should go to Burnham. But the reason why I bring this up, and the reason why I love this story, is it makes, I think, a central point about human creativity and about cities, which is that the skyscraper, like pretty much anything else that we as human beings have ever done, was not a solo affair, right? It was a social creation. It was a result of smart architects who worked with each other, right? All of these guys, right, Hollibard, Roche, Sullivan, and Burnham, all were at one point in time apprentices in Jenny's office, right? They all clearly borrowed ideas from one another. They all clearly built on each other's ideas. They were part of a chain of creativity that created the modern skyscraper, right? This vision, which Ayn Rand gave us of, Louis Sullivan working alone, contra to everything, right? It could not be farther from the truth, right? We get smart by being around other smart people. This is how we grow. This is what we are born to do. And this is how it was in the 1880s as well, when the Great Fire and the growth of Chicago created this influx of genius, all of which became much greater because it worked together. A similar thing happened in Detroit in the 1890s. Right? The skyscraper, in one sense, is the transformation of a city using one form of transportation technology, right? Because it's not just, of course, about the technology building up, it's also about the elevator, right? Without which the modern skyscraper is utterly unimaginable, which is fundamentally a transportation revolution. But there's another transportation revolution, of course, that pulled us out rather than up, that went on in Detroit in the 1890s. Detroit, of course, classic part of that transportation network, Detroit, the Straits. And it was natural that Detroit would have industries, would have firms like Detroit Dry Dock, a cutting-edge industrial firm that worked on producing ships, repairing them, engines that plied the inland waterways of America. And it was a training ground for young people like this character, Henry Ford, who came off the farm and got his start working on engines for Detroit Dry Dock. Cities then as now are forges of human capital, places that we come to learn from people around us. Ford then moved on to working with Edison and then got involved in this great race of American tinkerers in the 1890s to come up with the affordable car. Of course, Germans in their cities had figured out the basic technology of making automobiles, but they hadn't figured out how to make them cheaply. And that was our great innovation. But Ford, no more than, no more than Louis Sullivan, was an Ayn Rand hero, right? Ford was one of a cluster of automotive geniuses in Chicago. According to the first person to actually build a car in Detroit, sorry, I meant Detroit there. The first person to build a car in Detroit was Charles Kirby. And according to legend, Henry Ford followed Charles Kirby on a bicycle as he drove his car up and down the streets of Detroit, desperately trying to figure out how Kirby's car worked. Now, I suspect this story is false, but I so love the image of Ford pedaling furiously, trying to learn from Kirby's innovation that I can't give it up. And of course, Ford was not the only innovator in Detroit, right? I mean, there were the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar Buick, Billy Durant in nearby Flint, Ransom E. Olds, right? Every one of whom knew each other, worked with each other, supplied each other with parts and with financing, and most of all with ideas, right? And together they did this amazing thing. They figured out how to make mass-produced cars, right? An invention with incredible ramifications for the world, and in many ways a very benevolent innovation. Of course, in many ways a not so benevolent innovation. The problem, of course, from the city level is the form that Ford's innovation took, because the way that he figured out how to make cheap cars was to do it on a vast scale, right, in plants like the Rouge, right, vast, vertically integrated, walled off from the outside world, employing tens of thousands of less well-educated Americans, giving them good jobs. In one sense, this was a fantastic thing in the short run for Detroit. By some measures, Detroit was the most productive place in the planet in 1950 because of this idea. Right? On the other hand, this was a terrible model for long-run reinvention of the city. Successful cities at the start of the 19th century or in the late 18th century, like Birmingham in the age of Matthew Boulton and James Watt, or like New York in the age of Alexander Hamilton, were marked by smart people, small firms, and connections to the outside world. The same thing is true of successful cities today. How far from that is the Rouge, right? Vast firm, walled off from the outside world, employing lots of less educated workers. Right? This model, right, may be good in the short run, but ultimately, you don't need to put this factory in the city. And when conditions change, when transportation technologies change, it makes just as much sense to move the place somewhere else where it's cheaper. It follows the logic of cost minimization, and that logic tends to be very painful for cities. And so as transportation costs declined, and what you're looking at is the real cost of moving a ton a mile by rail during the 20th century, which dropped about 90% over the 20th century. So that while in 1900 or 1920 or even 1930, it made sense to locate a factory near the old rail network, near the Great Lakes, right? By 1970, those transportation cost advantages had become obsolete, and you might as well move it to a right-to-work state. You might as well move it to a suburb. You might as well move it to across the Pacific Ocean to wherever labor is cheapest, wherever you can save a few dollars. And so that's exactly what happened to manufacturing in the United States. Right? It moved from the old Rust Belt cities. It departed. Right? And it seems very unlikely that it will ever come back again, because that's fundamentally not what cities do that's good. These changes hit all of America's older, colder cities. In some sense, one way to think about it is the decline in transportation costs meant that we no longer had to locate in places where firms had a productive advantage, like access to Pittsburgh's coal mines or access to the waterways. We could locate in places where people wanted to live. This is an index that I put together based essentially on the price that people were willing to pay for houses in the area in 1980, controlling for income. So it says how much extra do people seem to be willing to pay for these areas, which is one reflection of how high the amenities are. And as you can see, it's very strongly predictive. People have moved to areas that have consumer amenities that make things attractive for people to live, rather than places that have innate productive advantages like coal mines. Now, of course, the consumer amenity that people appear to care about most is January temperature. Okay? Because what you're looking at here is the ranking of America's counties into fifth based on January temperature and the subsequent population growth between 2000 and 2010. And I know of no variable over the course of the 20th century which better predicts metropolitan area growth than January temperature. Now, that's not just about the moving to consumer-related cities. It's also about a number of different factors which go together. The elimination of the diseases which stalked the cities of the Old South, the rise of the air conditioner, the connection of the South with relatively pro-business policies. The work of Tom Holmes at the University of Minnesota shows a tremendous divide right on the border of right-to-work states, where manufacturing grew in the anti-union states and declined in the pro-union states. And of course, in recent decades, it's very associated with relatively pro-building policies but it's just a lot easier to lay down tens of thousands of units in Houston than it is in Boston. All of these things come together, but there's something to be said for warm Januaries as well, or at least the majority of Americans think so. And of course, along with the move to sun was the move to sprawl. We've always built our cities in ways that reflect the dominant transportation technology in the era in which we built our older cities have these wonderful, pedestrian walkways with narrow streets and short blocks that are connected with the way that we just walk around. And then as we added wheels to the mix, we laid down grids and created our streets that are straight. And then we sprawled further in the age of the elevated rail car and the age of the streetcar suburb, as Sam Bass Warner wrote. And of course, in the 20th century, we rebuilt our cities around the car, right? It's not surprising that we did so. It's not surprising there was huge demand for this. The average commute by car in this country is 24 minutes. The average commute by public transit is 48 minutes, right? It's not surprising that Americans wanted this, and it's not surprising that developers then created structures built around this. And on some basic level, right, as an economist, and this is again the sort of perspective of the economist who values choice, I think that it's good that people have choices. I indeed also, once I started acquiring small kids, also moved to a suburb. As much as I dream of sometime 15 years from now when my last child is out of high school and I can move to a studio apartment in a city. But the problem, of course, is that it's not as if cities and suburbs are competing on a level playing field. Right? And the problem is not with the fact that some people choose suburbs. It's fine that people choose suburbs. The problem is that, in fact, we have stacked the deck. And we stacked the deck with a series of policies like the home mortgage interest deduction, which creates a strong incentive to leave urban apartments and move to suburban homes. It also creates an incentive to borrow as much as possible, to bet on the vicissitudes of the housing market, and to build larger homes. We also stacked the deck with the highway system. The work of Nathaniel Baum Snow shows that each new highway that cut into a metropolitan area in the post-war period reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole. And it is utterly amazing to me that President Obama, who is in many ways the most urban president we've had since Theodore Roosevelt, right, has become such a huge champion of highway spending. Because in fact, when you hear infrastructure stimulus, you should think highways in Montana. Because in fact, that's where those dollars go, right? They go for the transportation. They follow the traditional highway trust fund formula. Right? And that's what has happened. And it's not as if there's, all highways are wrong, especially if they're paid for by the users, and especially if people pay for the environmental costs of their action. But we should be wary about using general tax revenues to subsidize people to drive. The move to sun and sprawl hit all of America's colder cities. These were the 10 largest cities in America in 1950. And 8 out of them lost 20% of their population or more over the next 50 years. 3 out of them lost 48% of their population or more over the next 50 years. And Detroit lost another 25% of their population since 2000, over the last decade. Just a complete hollowing out of these cities, accompanied, of course, by the social distress that so often can come along with economic decline. This is an image, I hope, since I haven't looked back at it. It's an image of the Detroit riot in 1967, a sort of sense that civilization, which was in some sense created by cities, had left it, that chaos was in control. And the federal government, again, didn't make things better. They followed something of a Potemkin village strategy of thinking that the real heart of the city was its structures and infrastructure, not the people. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't believe that structures and infrastructure play an absolutely vital role in making cities work. Of course they do. Of course our structures are crucial to it. But the hallmark of declining cities is that they have an abundance of buildings and an abundance of infrastructure relative to the number of people, relative to the level of demand, right? More than 90% of the homes in central city Detroit are currently priced below the physical cost of construction, even assuming Texas cost of construction, even assuming $80 a square foot, okay? It can't possibly make sense to use policies to subsidize more home construction in these areas. It didn't make sense to subsidize the building of new homes there in the 50s and 60s, when this is exactly what urban renewal policies did. And it certainly never made sense in a city in which there are less than half the people there than there were at the city at its height, in which you can get around easily because the roads aren't typically crowded. It never made sense to build a monorail to glide over essentially empty streets in Detroit, and yet this is what the federal government did. Starting with the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1973, it was there to invest in these systems based on a will-o'-the-wisp story, right? That despite the fact that there was no obvious demand for this thing, that somehow or other it would be transformational. It would move cities. Now, I believe in infrastructure, but it's so easy to tell ourselves myths, stories about how infrastructure can be transformational, that without hard data that actually goes through the cost-benefit analysis, we so often make mistakes. Like that famous Simpsons episode where the Music Man sold a monorail to their town. I think that's a fairly realistic episode. The sad truth about rail transit, this is from the work of Nathaniel Bamsnow and Matthew Kahn, is that this shows the change in the share of the population using public transit associated with a new rail line, a new subway line after the 1973 Federal Highway Act. And even if you change, what this thing means is even if you started 6 kilometers away from a subway stop and had all of that eradicated, right, that changed the share of the population using public transit by exactly 3 percentage points, right? That's how little it moved it. The ability to get Americans out of their cars into subway lines is very, very limited. And for that reason, you need to be very careful about throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at this infrastructure. You do, however, want to be quite aggressive at making sure that drivers pay for the social costs of their actions. Right? So you do want to think very hard about whether it's congestion prices or the appropriate carbon taxes. This is an image of Detroit Dry Dock today, which is still in many senses, and again, I shouldn't get out of my league, but I still find myself falling totally in love with this building. I mean, it's an amazing example of cutting-edge industrial architecture during its time, but of course it also is a tragedy, right? It also is a symbol of what was once great and now is gone. Now, of course, the story doesn't end there. Detroit, in fact, still has some chance of coming back, and I'm still rooting for the city. But some cities, like New York, like Boston, like San Francisco, like Seattle, were able to come back while others didn't. Right? There are 2 ways of understanding why some got back and some didn't. One is a way through stories, and the other way is through statistics. Now, the stories tend to show a common theme, which is idea-intensive industries involving lots of entrepreneurship. So think back to 1971. In Seattle, where 2 real estate jokers put up a sign, "Will the last person to leave Seattle please turn out the lights?" Right? Because Boeing was reducing its employment. And it seemed as if, goodness, Seattle was an industrial town. How was it going to ever come back? It's no better than Detroit. And yet, this is before Microsoft, before Amazon, before Costco, and Starbucks was just the faint whiff of a coffee aroma in some blenders' noses. The city became a hub of entrepreneurship. It attracted, through skilled residents and through skilled entrepreneurs, this remarkable chain of employers, and now is very much a model of 21st century urban success. Obviously, I can tell similar stories about Boston, about the chain of invention that starts out with MIT and then moves first into electronic technologies and then moves into biotechnology, smart people working on each other's ideas, creating these chains of innovation. New York, of course, is primarily a story about finance, right? 42% of the payroll in the island of Manhattan is in finance, and that shouldn't surprise us. If the comparative advantage of cities today is in enabling the flow of information, enabling the acquisition of knowledge, there's no industry where a little bit of extra knowledge can generate millions or perhaps even billions of dollars more quickly than finance, which is why it's particularly attracted to urban areas. And while I certainly hope and wish that New York would have a more balanced industrial structure, as it did at one point in time in the past, New York is still much better off with finance than it would be without it. Because in fact, that enables the whole city to do the things that it does. Now, there's a sense in which there's also a chain of invention in New York in finance, which tends, at least for me, to illustrate this urban ability to create chains, as I think it did in 1880s architecture in Chicago, where I'll feel more comfortable talking about the chain of invention in Renaissance Florence, right? Where Brunelleschi figures out the basic mathematics of linear perspective, passes it along to his friend, Donatello, who puts it in low relief sculpture on the outside wall of Orson Michele, below the statue of St. George, passes it along to his friend Masaccio, who puts it on the wall of Brancacci Chapel, that marvelous picture of Peter finding the coin in the belly of the fish, passes it along to his friend or student even, Fra Filippo Lippi, that less than saintly monk, passes it along to Botticelli and so forth. A chain of invention where one smart person borrows the other's ideas, and each new idea creates more openings, more avenues for innovation. They all knew each other, they all borrowed each other's ideas, and they created this chain that changed the world. Well, this is the economist in me. I like to think a similar thing happened in finance, okay? So in finance, there's a quantitative ability to think about the trade-offs between risk and return, which starts off at the University of Chicago with people like Harry Markowitz and Milton Friedman and Jimmy Savage. That then gets carried by people like Fisher Black and Jack Traynor to Wall Street. That ability to think quantitatively about risk and return enables the young Michael Milken, then still living in New York, to convince investors that his high-yield debt junk bonds, if you will, carried enough return to offset the risk. Those junk bonds then enabled the young Henry Kravis to engage in larger and larger leveraged buyouts, right, and push American firms to become slightly more attentive to shareholder interests. The rise of securitization, Lou Ranieri, who got his skills in the Saarinen Brothers mailroom, always a great place to acquire skills in a city, right, is part of that chain. And so is this guy, Michael Bloomberg. Now, I was not, in fact, an employee of Bloomberg View when I wrote the book, but now I am, as you just heard. So let's that sound as disclosure, or as I like to call it, advertising. I'm on every other Tuesday. But I keep Bloomberg in despite that for a reason, which is that he's both part of this chain, right? His terminals are part of this move towards a more quantitative approach to finance. It delivers the data that is the ultimate meat of that. And that's one reason why I keep it up. The second reason that I keep it up is it shows this ability that Jane Jacobs made so much about of cities to permit cross-industry fertilization. She liked to talk about the invention of the bra in New York. I like to talk about Bloomberg terminals. The basic point, of course, being that Bloomberg is not a financial billionaire. He's an information technology billionaire, right? He jumps from Saarinen Brothers into information technology, but he's able to make that jump and to be successful in a way that no Silicon Valley mogul living in splendid isolation at Atherton could ever have been, because he's actually run the trading floor at Saarinen Brothers, because he was exiled to their tech operation. He knows what the guys at Merrill Lynch want, and he's able to deliver it, right? The city has made him wise. The city has made him smart. And he's able to make a leap across industries and become wildly successful as a result. But I like this for a third reason, because it's actually also about the physical space, right? This is the bullpen at City Hall, this wall-less office where people connect with each other, right? Which is modeled on the bullpen at Bloomberg LLP, which is modeled on the Saarinen Brothers trading floor. At least that's what Bloomberg says. There's something, while there are certainly debates in City Hall about how functional this is within City Hall, there's no question that trading floors are, the universally ascribed to system within financial trading firms. And in some sense, there's something odd about them. Because here we have some of the wealthiest people in the planet who in a normal industry would sit protected by oaken walls, by large offices, right, enjoying all the perquisites of privacy that their prosperity should give them. And yet here they are, right on top of each other, right, experiencing all the discomfort of having someone else smell your sweat. Right? But they're there because they need to know what's going on. They're there because they need to hear, to feel what's going on in the markets, to know what's happening. They're there ultimately. They're willing to put up with those inconveniences ultimately because knowledge is more important than space. And that's fundamentally why cities came back, because knowledge was more important than space, because people were willing to put up with the inconveniences of being close to each other in cities because it was so important to be smart. Right? And this explains our puzzle that we started with, why globalization and new technologies have made cities more, not less important. Because what globalization and new technologies have done, and there are literally hundreds of studies showing this, is that they have increased the returns to being smart. They've increased the returns to innovation. They've increased the returns to skill. They've increased the returns to human capital. Right? Because the world has become more complicated. Because the trivial tasks are automated. Because if you have a new idea, you can sell it on the other side of the planet, or you can source it on the other side of the planet. Right? All of these things have made it much more valuable to be inventive, to be smart, to have a new good idea. Now that only plays into cities' strengths, because in fact we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. We come out of the womb with a remarkable ability to soak up information from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, even occasionally from our teachers. Cities enable us to do that. And it's fine. We can schedule a teleconference. But you can't schedule the unplanned things that Mike Bloomberg would have gotten as a young man working at Saarinen Brothers. You can't schedule the things that you pick around, right, as a young architect just being in Robert Stern's office, right? You can't schedule this stuff, right? You learn by being there, by seeing the people screw up who are older than you, by seeing them make brilliant decisions. That's how we learn. That's certainly how I learned, right? And I suspect it's true of all of you. And cities make this happen. And they're not at risk from the fact that we can, do some low-level interactions electronically. Those things, in fact, make the unplanned interactions even more important. And as the world gets more complicated, the value of face-to-face connection also gets more valuable. Anyone who teaches knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your script. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting into the heads of the people you're talking to. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is catching their imagination or making their minds click. And we have evolved over millions of years to have these remarkable cues for communicating comprehension or confusion at close quarters. When you're not in the same room, you give that up. Right? And it becomes far harder. And the more complicated the idea is, the more you're likely to lose by not being there. Now, all of these stories, of course, have statistics that go along with them. What you're looking at here is the relationship between the share of the population with a college degree as of 1970 and subsequent population growth across all the metropolitan areas in the US. It's a nice, positive relationship. But if you look just at the older cities of the Northeast and the Midwest, it's a remarkably strong relationship. Skills really are destiny for this group. If you want to understand why Boston is doing better than Buffalo or New York is doing better than Detroit, right, you just look at the share of the population with college degrees. About 1 in 8 adults in Detroit have a college degree. More than 50% of adults in Seattle do, right? These cities are doing exactly as well as you'd expect their human capital to cause them to do. The most educated group here, as of 1970, experienced subsequent growth rates of 53%. The least educated experienced growth rates of 8%. Right? Enormous gulf. Human capital is the bedrock on which cities and nations last. This is, of course, came out after the book. This is population growth 2000 to 2010. And education across all the counties in the US. And as you can see, the most educated fifth had growth of about 13%. The least educated fifth had growth of about 3%. Enormous connection between skills and success, right? I often argue that the best economic development strategy is to attract and empower smart people and then more or less get out of their way. And that's certainly what we saw over and over again in cities, that people like the Bill Gates or I'm on the advisory board of the Gates Foundation. I need to disclose that as well. The Starbucks guys. I do occasionally drink Starbucks coffee. Well, but skills really are destiny. And one way to think about this is what economists call human capital externalities. And what you're looking at here is what, with the enormously eloquent title of the log wage residual, like that, which is essentially your wages controlling for everything I know about you. And then we take this, we average this, so controlling for your years of schooling, and then we connect this with the share of the population in your metropolitan area with a college degree. And the fact is that as the share of the population in your metropolitan area with a college degree increases by 10%, your wages go up on average by 8%, holding your skills constant. The work of Enrico Moretti has really shown this. And there are a whole bunch of sort of smart statistical ways of getting at this, like those cities that had land-grant colleges prior to 1940, those metropolitan areas, have done remarkably better over the last 20 years. There really is some truth to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's own old line that the best way to build a successful city was to attract 2 world-class universities and wait 50 years. This, of course, has a long-standing history of cities. I'm just going to skip over this. But the most important skills in cities, of course, are not the things that people learn in college. In fact, I'm often amazed that anyone finds any practical use to anything I say. It's the things that are learned outside of college. It's the things that Lou Ranieri learned in the Salomon Brothers mailroom. And in fact, it's hard to think of anything that's more important for urban success than the skills and inclination to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz argued that New York appeared to be more resilient than Pittsburgh even then, because New York's industrial history was one that was extremely conducive towards the accumulation of entrepreneurial human capital. That the garment industry, New York's dominant industry, was an industry in which anyone could get started with a couple of sewing machines and a good idea. Right? And in fact, in my book, I tell the story of A.E. Lefcourt, who built more skyscrapers than any New Yorker did prior to the 1929, which when he famously declared that he was sure that 1930 would be the greatest of all building years. And I'm paraphrasing. He was wrong on that, showing perhaps an irrational exuberance that occasionally does show up in the development community. And of course, the father of Sandy Weil, a Citicorp, also starts in the garment industry. It's legion, the number of people who get their start in this, where it's very easy to begin your own firm. By contrast, think about Pittsburgh and U.S. Steel, right? How the heck, Pittsburgh, U.S. Steel trains company men, right? It didn't train entrepreneurs. You worked for U.S. Steel for your life. You weren't going to start some new company if U.S. Steel went down, no more than the guys who worked for General Motors were going to go out on their own and start some new company when General Motors faltered. So that can be, again, enormously productive in the short run. But when it comes to reinventing the city, I'll take entrepreneurship any day of the week. And measures of entrepreneurship like the share of employment in startups, or this is another popular measure, which is the average firm size, the number of firms per worker. Places with lots of little firms are over there, and places with a few big firms. And what you can see is the places that have lots of little firms had about 3 times more employment growth between 1977 and 2000 than the places with a few large firms. And we can actually trace things back. My work with Bill Kerr, we've actually gone back and looked at mineral ore deposits in 1900, which then predicts having large firms, and then seeing that bears out on the whole economic history of the city over the next 100 years, that there are large firms 70 years later, even in financial services, even in industries unrelated to these ores, and those places do more poorly over the last 2 decades. Now, the success of cities, right, is of course accompanied, as I suggested at the beginning of the paper, by enormous challenges as well. Right? If two people are close enough to give each other an idea face to face, they're also close enough to give each other a contagious disease. And if you're close enough to sell somebody a newspaper, you're also close enough to rob that person. Right? And for 3,000 years, cities have been battling with the downsides of density. Perhaps the most important downside of density is contagious, almost surely waterborne diseases, right, which turned our cities into killing fields throughout most of their history. A boy born in New York City in 1900 could expect to live 7 years less than the national average. Current life expectancy is about 2 years longer in New York than the national average. No one exactly knows why that's true among older New Yorkers, why there currently is more health. Some people argue that it's walking, some people argue that it's social connection. Among young people, it's really obvious, though. It's lower levels of suicide rate in large cities and lower levels of motor vehicle accidents. Just taking the subways after a few drinks is just a heck of a lot safer than getting behind the wheel of a car. But the safety of cities didn't happen cheaply, right? The battle for clean water was extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive. And it involved a number of mistaken turns. In the 1790s, most of the major cities along the eastern seaboard battled with yellow fever epidemics, and while they certainly didn't understand the basic medicine of it, they certainly thought that providing better water would be one step forward. Philadelphia went the way of providing public waterworks, which Latrobe did. New York followed a somewhat crazy public-private partnership cooked up by these two characters. It was really Burr's idea, right, that he was going to get the ability to run a bank by promising to provide water. So Burr hires Hamilton, whom of course he would later shoot, to be his lawyer, representing his interest at the Federalist City Council. And Hamilton explained to his Federalist buddies, using language that would be so recognizable today, that public provision of water would lead to burthensome taxes that New York could not possibly pay. So as a result, the Federal City Council went along with Burr's idea and gave him the right to run a water company that was going to be subsidized with the ability of Burr to run a bank. Right? Now, any economist worth his salt should know that this is a stupid design of a system. Right? You don't incentivize a relatively non-remunerative activity, providing clean water, by giving someone the ability to do a highly remunerative activity instead. Right? And unsurprisingly, of course, Burr's company did a lot of banking and not a lot of water provision. Of course, it's now J.P. Morgan Chase, which was the Chase Manhattan Bank, which was the Bank of the Manhattan Water Company. It's still with us, and it still isn't producing a lot of water, although it is, in fact, it appears to be an urban myth that this thing is actually the cross-section of a water pipe. Although, again, that's an urban myth that I like, but it doesn't actually appear to be true. Some things, like water, required massive public interventions, massive public investments. But other urban curses, like congestion, right, can't be solved by engineering alone. We can't just build our way out of traffic jams. There's something called the fundamental law of traffic congestion, which shows, this is the work of Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner, that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. If you built it, they will drive. Right? The only way to get people to not to use city streets is to charge them for it. It's to actually price valuable commodities like we price everything else. And Singapore, which is the second densest country on the planet, has relatively rapidly moving streets, as you can tell, because they charge people for driving on crowded city streets. You can't run, the old Soviet-style grocery system didn't work very well, right? You give away a valuable commodity and you charge far too little of it, and the result is long lines and stockouts. Well, that's what we're doing with our urban traffic policy, right? We're running a Soviet-style traffic policy where we give away something valuable for low prices, and the result is long lines and stockouts, right? Which is exactly what an urban traffic jam is. And the right to drive freely on roads was not snuck into the Bill of Rights somewhere after the Fourth Amendment, right? I mean, there's no reason why you can't price these things, and indeed Singapore works well. Now, if cities are able to deal with the downsides of density, they can be places of enormous pleasure as well as productivity. The same innovation and entrepreneurship that makes cities great places to do cutting-edge technologies also makes them great places to eat cutting-edge cuisines, right? And the same ability of cities to pay for the fixed costs of having a sugar refinery in the early 19th century also enables them to pay for the fixed costs of having a great museum or having a great opera house, right? That scale helps make cities fun. But of course, the most fun thing about cities is the fact that other people are there. One of the things, of course, that's striking is how many young single people are attracted to living in urban areas. Well, they're above all because that's where other young single people are. And that's, again, cities as marriage markets, if you prefer. Or now, This, of course, required, this sort of relatively rosy vision of cities, of course, required also dealing with these demons, and I haven't had time to talk about the crime problem, but this again required, a very significant public investment, and one that, in fact, while the streets have become dramatically safer, showing a huge public success, it has only been done at the cost of incarcerating vast numbers of Americans, and we haven't actually figured out how to do this in a way that is at a lower human cost. Now, the consequence of having cities succeed as places of pleasure as well as productivity is that demand for urban space goes up. Right? Now I'm going to be a real economist for you. Demand for urban space goes up. And if that demand is not met with more supply, then prices will rise. There's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. Right? And that's exactly what has happened in many of our older, colder cities, the ones that actually did manage to come back. So what you're looking at here is the declining number of permits in New York, that's the falling one, and the rising number of prices. Just as New York was getting its act together, it was actually building fewer and fewer units. And if you want to understand why New York's growth was below expectations over the last decade, you only need to look at the permitting activity, because typically population growth is just a few percentage points below the number of permits. And given the permitting activity in New York between 2000 and 2010, it's exactly the population growth that you would expect. Boston had faster population growth than the state of Massachusetts for the first time since 1870, precisely because the Boston Redevelopment Authority assiduously went after permitting more units. And when cities say no to building, whether it's because of traditional zoning rules or modern preservation districts, they're ensuring that the city isn't going to grow as much, and they're ensuring that prices are going to go up. It doesn't mean that those policies are wrong. It just means that there's always a cost to them, right? And this is, I think, where Jane Jacobs made what I think is her most important mistake. And it's not that she was for something that was wrong. I mean, there are certainly very good arguments for things like the Greenwich Village Preservation District, Historic Preservation District. But she also made the argument, which turns out to be completely wrong, that preserving old buildings was going to preserve affordability in the city. And she used her ground eye level of journalistic observation to note that old buildings were cheap and new buildings were expensive, and that led her to conclude that the way to make sure that cities remain cheap was to make sure that no one built any new buildings on top of old buildings. Well, that is not how supply and demand works. Right? You do not preserve affordability by not letting anyone deliver more space to the area, by freezing an area in amber. And you need look no further than Greenwich Village, which is an extraordinarily charming place, and I am in no sense, right, denigrating the charms of Greenwich Village, but I will say one thing: it is not affordable. Okay? It is not a cheap place where you can buy a townhouse the way that Jane Jacobs and her husband did 60 years ago if you're an ordinary income American. Now, this is the cost of restricting building. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it always means that any time you're saying no to a new unit that's being built, you're saying no to a family that would like to move into the city. And you're saying that the families that do live there are going to face higher prices. She was, by the way, completely right about the high-rise public housing districts, which is a slightly different issue. But America has undergone a sea change in the way that we approach housing limitations. And what you're looking at here, and where huge differences across space, the way America is being shaped by local land use decisions. If you want to understand why Dallas and Houston and Phoenix and Atlanta all added 1 million people or more between 2000 and 2010, those are the metropolitan areas, you need look no further than the fact that they make it extraordinarily easy to build. These are not the most, these places don't have the most productive economies, they don't have the most charming climates, and yet they make it easy to build, and so they do build. What you notice here is that places that are really expensive don't build a lot, and places that build a lot aren't really expensive. That can't be explained by just saying that there are differences in demand. Right? There's plenty of demand for New York, and there's plenty of demand for Las Vegas, or at least there used to be. But Las Vegas, because it allows building, adds a lot of people. New York, because it allows less building, it becomes more expensive. I've occasionally been seen as being a supporter of skyscrapers, as if I had an opinion on where people should live. I don't. I believe that people should have choices, and I personally think skyscrapers are nice, but I certainly understand people who don't like it. What I've tried to emphasize is there are costs to restricting that type of development. And that, in fact, we need to take into account those costs when we make these decisions. And while the consequences of excessive restrictions on building in the US are significant, they're extraordinary, and I would argue even catastrophic in cities like Mumbai, which is labeled under a maximum floor area ratio in much of the city of 1.25 over much of the last 40 years, motivated by I would argue, benighted view that restricting floor area ratios will artificially, limit the growth of the city. Of course, it hasn't limited the growth of the city. I don't think they should have been trying to limit the growth of the city. And all it has done is ensured that the city is dysfunctional, that it built out instead of up, that it developed none of the sort of highly connected, taller areas that would have led towards usable sidewalks. And the tragedy is that India remains far poorer than it would have been if Mumbai and the other cities of India had been able to play their role more surely of moving the country towards development. I want to end with an environmental story, because I think one of the reasons why allowing cities to build up, why allowing urban growth is so valuable, is that cities also have an environmental role to play. The ancient view of cities, which is that there's sort of, it's the sort of Lorax fallacy, if you will, that living around nature is green and living around cities is brown. I think that's fundamentally mistaken. And I like to tell a story of a young Harvard graduate who, a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord. And he went to do a little fishing with a friend of his, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. And when he came to cook the fish into a chowder, that's what we do up in New England, we cook chowders, the wind flicked the flames to the nearby dry grass, and a fire started, and it spread. And it became an inferno. And by the time it was done, it had wiped out more than 300 acres of prime woodland, almost an entire small ecosystem eradicated from the face of the earth. In his own day, this young man was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freeman called him a flibbertigibbet, which I think was pretty bad for 1844. And indeed, they were surely right to do so. I can't think of any young man living in Boston or Cambridge in 1844 who did as much damage to the environment as this guy. Of course, somewhat oddly, he is today revered as the secular saint of American environmentalism. He is Henry David Thoreau, whose book Walden appears to preach a gospel of what a wonderful thing it is for people to live around nature. Whereas his own life seems to tell a slightly different story, right? I mean, I think the moral of the Thoreau story is that we are a very destructive species, and if you live nature, it's often best, if you love nature, it's often best to stay away from it. As indeed Thoreau would have done nature a tremendous turn if he had stayed in Cambridge and stuck to his books instead of going out into the woods. Now, I know of what I speak because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I too left the city such as it is of Cambridge 5 years ago when I started acquiring small children. Only economists talk about acquiring small children, and moved to a suburb not that far away from Walden Pond. This is a story that's similarly recounted by David Owen in his fine book Green Metropolis. And of course, I found myself doing what Americans do everywhere, and using a whole lot more energy than I ever had living in an urban area, both from, of course, driving and from the fact that the house size increases, and so you use a lot more energy. Together with Matthew Kahn, I've tried to estimate carbon emissions associated with a standardized household, meaning you don't want to just compare city residents and suburbanites and assume that they're identical, right? Because suburbanites are more likely to be somewhat wealthier, they're more likely to have larger families. You want to control for those things. But even controlling for those things, there's a fairly significant gap between suburban energy use and central city energy use, and it's coming both from smaller housing units in cities. It's not, again, that apartments use less energy per square foot than suburban homes. They don't. They actually use more. But it's when people are living in apartments, they're just living in such smaller units per capita that they end up using significantly less energy. And then, of course, it's also less energy from the combination of driving and public transit. And for most of Americans, before you get too hung up on public transit, this is mostly about driving shorter distances rather than longer distances, because our country is still very much oriented towards the automobile, but there are huge gains even from living in more compact spaces in terms of energy use, even if you're not getting into a car. I'm going to skip over that. And just end on this note, which is that if India and China, right, the great growing economies of India and China, see their carbon emissions rise to the level seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions will go up by about 130%, just on its own. Right? Nothing else changing, no population increasing, massive increase. If they rise but stop at the level seen at hyperdense but still prosperous Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%. Right? I don't care if you're interested in global warming or you just care about the price of gas at the pump. Right? The whole world has a lot to be gained if India and China build up rather than sprawling out in terms of their emissions. And that's one reason why we need to, I think, as a country, rethink our own policies that artificially push people away from urban centers. And that's the combination of the home mortgage interest deduction, as I mentioned, is a combination of subsidizing car usage on highways. And it's also about our very difficult system of local schools. There's nothing more that pushes parents away from cities than the way that we structure our schools, and that doesn't have to be. There are cities from Paris to Stockholm that do a wonderful job of giving parents great schools if they locate in the city. We just need to be more creative and allow the same powers of urban innovation and entrepreneurship to do great things for restaurants, to do great things for food as well. Cities continue to face challenges, and the world continues to face challenges. But I don't want, and these challenges are enormous, be they global warming, be they the problems of poverty. But But I think the basic message that I want to end on is hopeful, because we have been facing challenges as a species for thousands and thousands of years. And our ability as a species to work miracles, to solve them, be they the provision of clean water or the creation of the skyscraper or Renaissance art, our ability to work miracles is remarkable. And we don't do it as solo operators. We do it when we're connected, when we leverage each other, when we learn from each other. And that's what makes universities work and schools work, and it's also what makes cities work. It's what makes them such a special part of humanity. Thank you very much.
For us to admit that someone at Harvard could give a good talk, but thank you very, very much for that wonderful talk. I'm sure there are some questions and comments from people in the audience, starting with Alex Garvin, but wait for the mic.
I was struck at the table that you showed at the beginning, the 10 largest cities in the United States had one winner, Los Angeles, with an increase of 87%.
Yes, yes.
How do you explain that success?
Well, it seems to verify the sunshine hypothesis, doesn't it? Right? I mean, it's a combination of sun and sprawl. But there are, of course, other things involved in Los Angeles. It also has a cluster of talent, right? It also the role of entertainment in Los Angeles, I think, continues to illustrate the role that cities have in creating creativity. One of the things that I was struck by when I was doing research for this book, which, you know, nothing's better than doing research for books about cities because it means walking around cities, which is, you know, pretty much the best thing in the world. But I was struck walking around the slums of Mumbai or Kolkata at how darn ubiquitous the ads for James Cameron's movie Avatar were, right? I couldn't escape the Avatar signs, and it just seemed to be a symbol of, here was this thing created by American ingenuity that was being sold everywhere. And it sort of reminded you about what, you know, the magic that comes out of urban connection, even on the other coast. Los Angeles is not off the regression line. It really is exactly, you know, and it's exactly where you'd expect it to be, given the combination of sunshine and you know, it also takes advantage of the car orientation as well. But it's not doing surprisingly well relative to those sort of fundamentals, if you will.
It's a company town, LA.
Well, there's also aerospace.
Either you're in the
days,
entertainment business or you're not.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a question back there.
So it sounds like the unplanned exchange of ideas is one of the most important aspects of a city's value, but it also sounds like that's something that's very hard to measure. I wonder if there's some kind of data point you can look at to try to quantify that directly.
Well, people try to. I mean, one of the things that we use to measure the exchange of ideas are things like citation rates to patents. So the work of it's too late in the evening. The work on patent citation has shown a very strong tendency of people to cite patents that are close, that are physically proximate to them, which I think shows some evidence of that, although that isn't exactly unplanned stuff. There also is significant evidence of actually experimental work where they allow people to meet face-to-face versus not and show significantly better coordination as a result of those face-to-face meetings. But you're right, the unplanned stuff is incredibly hard to measure. One thing that I'm hoping to convince the Boston Redevelopment Authority to allow me to do is they're curating they're building this innovation district downtown and on the waterfront, and they are allowing a certain number of people to enter at below market rate housing for sort of entrepreneurial spaces. And they're going to curate in who the entrepreneurs are. And I am being something of a social scientist. I'm trying to convince them to actually, once they select their 100 entrepreneurs, to actually randomize in 50 of them, so we'll have a genuine treatment and control of what the impact is on long-run entrepreneurial success of being randomized into this physical space versus not being randomized in. But you're right, measurement does tend to be difficult, the more unplanned. And it also is a lesson about why, I mean, the work of Josh Lerner, called Boulevard and Broken Dreams, reminds us about how the unplanned nature of urban innovation and entrepreneurship means that most public attempts to micromanage it from City Hall have been colossal failures. That it is very, very difficult to sort of play venture capitalist from a local government. And the most successful examples we've seen of industrial policy are, at least I would argue, human capital policy in disguise. So Singapore is typically held up as being a relatively successful move along, and I think the most positive view of what Lee Kuan Yew did was by pushing Singapore gradually up the food chain of industries, he actually upskilled his people and enabled them to move up to the next level. I think that's just as a general lesson about how you think about economic development investments. I think the right thing to ask is not how many jobs it's creating today, but how many skills and how many entrepreneurs it's creating 5 years from now. That's the question that you have to ask yourself about these investments.
Question way back there. We'll bring you the mic.
I don't know if enough time has elapsed for us to see the changes that can be brought by the internet and how people interact because of the internet. You know, I can imagine rooms filled with cameras all over and screens all over that allow for that unplanned interaction that you're talking about.
It's possible. You know, I've been grappling with this issue for almost 20 years. I wrote my first paper on are electronic communications and face-to-face communications complements or substitutes, which is the economist's way of saying it, 1994. And there we were more worried about faxes than we were about the internet. But it is remarkable. I mean, one of the data points there are a number of data points that you look for. Is, for example, who are the big users of these technologies? Are they people who are in dense urban areas versus not? And typically, people who connect electronically are also people who meet each other, right? People who you don't call people very often who you're not likely to meet unless you're in the solicitation business. But another piece of evidence is what happened to the time series of business travel, right? So all this electronic communication was supposed to make business travel unnecessary because, after all, we just connect. But the opposite happened, right? Starting in 1985, there was an explosion in the amount of business travel, which didn't seem to be explained by anything going on in terms of changing fares. Also, there's things like the rise in co-authorship in various disciplines, or my own favorite data point, which is, of course, we have the whole history of the telephone, which 110 years ago was thought to be a great boon for rural living, that it was going to level the playing field between cities and rural life and end this crazy urbanization trend. That clearly didn't happen. Right? In fact, most of the time we think of telephones as being positively associated with urbanization, not negatively associated. But my favorite data point on this is, in fact, that the industry, of all industries that you think of as having the best access to electronic communications, is also the industry that has become the most famous example of a geographic cluster in the world today. Silicon Valley, right? If there's one industry where you'd think they would have solved this problem and would have no need to be face-to-face, it would be them. If there's one company that would be able to do this, it would be Google, right? But what does Google do? They build the Googleplex, right? They build a thing so that everyone can be right next to each other and can learn from one another. What does Zappos do? It tries to redevelop Las Vegas. I mean, it's the guys in this industry understand that you actually have to be in the midst of things in order to learn. And any time I talk to a young ambitious software person, they will uniformly tell me that they need to actually go to Silicon Valley to be in the mix, right? They need to be there physically around the people where the action is in order to acquire the skills to be successful in their industry. Sure, we can manage to do consulting in Bangalore, but to be there is valuable. Of course, Bangalore itself is now an example of extreme connectivity of the people who are living there. Maybe from the U.S. perspective, it's a flat world phenomenon where it's in the edge of nowhere. But from the Indian perspective, right, it's a teeming hive of entrepreneurial and innovative talent. But you're right, we don't know. And once we have the beam me up Scotty technology, all bets are off.
Keller?
Wondering, in all the places where you've been giving talks, maybe many of them in the United States, which is a suburban nation, do you find that your audiences are surprised and flabbergasted by this information? And in some ways, have you written a book that is, for many urbanists, right? This is sort of mother's milk, this message, right? But so are you, in a sense, writing a book that's this kind of sly polemic to a suburban nation?
I certainly hoped to, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote this book was to try and challenge the notion that it's the suburban home is the only way to be a real American. Unquestionably, I believe that very strongly, and that's certainly one of the reasons why I wrote it. On the other hand, it runs up against my basic view that it's almost impossible to change grown adults' minds on anything.
Not to mention students.
No, I think if they haven't thought enough about the issue, you have some chance. So I think that's the hope. I think probably actually where I've had but American battle lines are so drawn on this stuff, and the politics are just awful, right? I mean, being connected with one political party is a terrible place to be in terms of the political debate. You really want to be desperately fought over by the two parties. You want to be in the center. And cities have this long-standing PR problem that everyone can see what the heck a cow does, what a farmer does, and we can all get misty-eyed about the silos and the wheat that feeds us. And nobody knows exactly what an urban, design consultant does, or even worse, an urban management consultant or financier, worst of all, right? I mean, so it all just seems mysterious and wicked. And I think all of these things make it very, very hard to push back on this. On top of the fact that we've rigged the Senate in a way that overpowers, gives excessive power to low-density areas relative to high-density areas. The area where I think I actually have felt as if I've had some success in terms of changing minds is actually mostly in the developing world, where you actually you don't have the battle lines drawn, where they're not sure exactly what they think about cities versus rural areas, where there's some of the Gandhi-esque stuff that's still around, but they're well aware that they're living in a world in which the cities are changing the countries. And there actually is a world in which there's much more openness on this. But certainly I hope to have an impact closer to home, but I'm less optimistic that I have. But
Have time for one more question? Yes? Kyle?
As an architect, I found the title of your book very encouraging, but could you talk a little bit more about your choice of title and particularly perhaps about the order in which you put the adjectives?
I received an advance from the publisher for a book that was not titled the same as this book, and the publisher made up the title. And there was a certain amount of fighting about, I tried to actually keep happier out of the title, but I was unsuccessful on that, and I bowed to the publisher's superior knowledge on this. But I had absolutely no input whatsoever on the actual choice of the words in the title.
Even authors, it would appear, have clients.
Indeed. You can see my own tremendous skill at coming up with catchy titles, and the titles to say my previous book, Cities, Agglomeration Economies, and I can't even remember, and the Spatial Equilibrium, guaranteed to sell three copies. So given how adept I thought, given that I knew my own limitations in this area, it seemed best to just cave in. But I had no input to do with it.
Okay. Is there a last question? That's certainly a fascinating. What went back there? I don't want to cut anything off, or anyone off.
Have you looked into what roles artists play in revitalizing cities? Do you talk about that at all? Or?
It's very, very hard to quantify this, and I certainly believe it extraordinarily. But I certainly believe that beauty is an incredibly valuable urban asset, and it's certainly something that we cherish. It turns out to be very hard to actually do this in a serious quantitative way. The correlations that I talked about, like the skills urban success correlation, are incredibly profound. And I certainly believe that one potential reason for this is one of the things that skilled people do is they move to cities that are more beautiful, and that's part of what makes them successful.
Sorry, as far
He
as...
means a practicing artist.
as artists, as say Venice Beach, dilapidated, rundown places where artists moved first, and then people followed, and then
there's lots of... You can read my review of Richard Florida's book, written 12 years about this, and I'm very friendly with Richard. In fact, if you look at the book, he cites someone remembers being in the car supposedly where I told him that there was a correlation between skills and urban growth. But when you try and look, at least when I tried to look at other measures of creativity, I found nothing that was statistically significant once you'd controlled for the share of the population with a college degree in the initial period, which doesn't mean that it isn't so, right? This is a very important thing about the limitations of statistics. It means that you can't actually say it one way or the other with any degree of precision. So it's not that I don't believe in my bones that actually having a thriving creative community in the area in lots of ways is incredibly valuable. I do believe that, but I couldn't, I don't think the data gives you you're best off just believing in in the life that you live rather than trusting the data.
But I'm just thinking about say Detroit. So why aren't educated people moving there? Why people moving because they want that sort of energy, which sometimes is created through sort of.
Hold the mic up or no one will hear what you're saying.
I don't know if this is work. Oh, it is working.
It's working
okay.
if you do it.
That's kind of where I guess. for Detroit, how do you see Detroit sort of, I mean, it's kind of a big question.
The Detroit question. How do you see Detroit coming back? I mean, Detroit has unbelievably cheap housing. It has this wonderful legacy. It has lots of beautiful buildings, or at least I think they're beautiful. Again, I have no standing on that. But it's got an enormously high hurdle to fight up, right? I mean, if you think that successful cities are about small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world, Detroit had, was the epitome of big firms, an industrial monoculture, right? And, lower levels of formal education. This is an enormously difficult hurdle to go over, and the politics of Detroit didn't help it. I think right now Detroit has sort of basic physical problems. It needs to think about shrinking its physical footprint in a way that's smart. It needs to be about providing infrastructure that's appropriate for a radically smaller city than the one that it was built for. It needs to figure out what to do wisely with its space. But I think the right question going forward is not to ask itself how Detroit can come back in the sense of being a city of 1.2 or 1.85 million people again. It's actually how to ask whether or not the children living in Detroit will have a brighter future, whether or not they stay in that city or not, which is more of an issue of asking about how to make sure that their streets are safe and their schools are competent. I mean, just once I want to hear a mayor say, sure, my city lost 10% of its population over my watch, but the people who left went on to great jobs in Dallas and Seattle, and I'm proud of that because I educated them to do that. And that really is the ultimate mission of city governments is to enrich and empower the lives of their citizens, whether or not they stay there or not. And I think Detroit really has to be focused on the people. And that's, I guess, if I had a final message to a room full of architects, who do this thing that I revere and that I cherish every day of my life, seeing the work of architects of this age and past ones, it's that there's this wonderful synergy between the human capital and the physical capital. And that while I do argue that the real city is the human capital, that human capital relies critically on the physical capital that surrounds it, on the beauty, on the ideas, on the structures that are built. And it's ultimately all about the magic of that synergy in terms of the success of cities. And I'll end.
Thank you.